Hello and welcome to this Blender Cookie tutorial. My name is Kent Trammell, and in this video we're going to create a car paint shader for cycles. Hopefully this will be the first video in kind of an ongoing series of creating various material types. So here in Blender 2.7 we have a scene that you can download in the source files if you have a citizen membership, and we have a ground plane with a camera as well as lights that are all focused on this object here that's designed specifically to showcase material qualities. And down here in the bottom right, I have another 3D view that's set up for the camera that I will be doing my viewport rendering. And I'll enable that with Shift-Z in the viewport. And if I go ahead and maximize this, you can see what the lighting setup is like and how this object is ready to be rendered and test a material. So let's go ahead and create this material by first switching over to the node editor in this big viewport. And I'll hit N to get rid of our side panel. And then in our material tab of the properties, I'll click New. And I'm going to name this Car Paint. And here we have our initial nodes where we are ready to begin creating this car paint shader. But before I start, let's take a look at a reference image. So I'll switch over to the UV image editor and open my reference right here, where we have this kind of hot rod custom vehicle with a very appealing blue car paint shader. And this will be a great reference to guide me along this process. So let's think about what's actually happening here. For one, there's an underlying blue color, obviously, and also we have reflections here on the side. But as with anything that has reflections, we have a Fresnel component, and this is very clear here where our reflections at this location, where the surface is more directly facing the camera, the reflections are a little more subtle, and they kind of fade into the blue color. But then as we go down the wheel well, we can very clearly see how the reflections become more prominent and lose the blue color. So it's more of a mirror-like finish, and especially here in the asphalt color, that's being reflected here in the car paint reflections. So we will definitely want to implement that Fresnel element. And what else? One thing about car paint shaders is it kind of goes along with the Fresnel idea, except it's dealing with the color. And where the surface faces us more directly, the blue color is a little bit more vibrant. And then as the surface gradually faces away from us, the blue color starts to darken. And it can be a little hard to tell at this spot. But if we go up here, for example, right here, the car paint is vibrant and higher in value. And then as we progress down the side, it gets darker and darker. That's also very apparent right here, where it's brighter and then gradually gets darker and darker as it wraps around the surface. So not only will Fresnel be affecting the reflections, but it'll also be reflecting the underlying color of our paint. And then finally, let's look at the actual reflections, because there's a couple layers that we want to mimic. And number one is we have kind of a flaky, sparkly layer right here. Let me get rid of this grease paint layer real quick. And notice with these reflections that we have one that's very bright, and then we have almost a secondary reflection that kind of surrounds it. And this one is a little bit sparkly with some reflective flakes in there. This is another very prominent characteristic of car paint that I will want to include in my shader. So let's get rid of that grease paint. And I will split my viewport this time and use the bottom half as the node editor, leaving my reference up top that I can continue to study. And the first part of the shader that I want to tackle is the Fresnel component. So let's add an input. I like the layer weight node. And then following that, I will add a converter color ramp. If you've watched any of my shading training before, you could probably do this in your sleep, because I've repeated it so many times. But after that, we will add a emission shader just to test exactly what our Fresnel value is doing. And we'll plug that into the surface output and take a closer look in our render viewport, perhaps make a little bit more room for the rendered version down here. Okay, so here you can see what's happening. And according to our color ramp, the white value is wrapping around the sides of our object, and then the black value is influencing the surface that directly faces the camera. So I can drag down my flags here to get a little bit different result. I'm going to switch the interpolation to B-spline instead, just to get some smoother transitions from black to white. And let's maybe drag the white flag up just a bit. Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty good. And now I can use this black and white factor that we've just created for not only the reflections, but also for the underlying blue color. And I think I'll start with the underlying color, which will be plugged into a diffuse BSDF. So Shift A, let's add a color mix RGB node, and that's going to come after the color ramp, where the color ramp will actually affect the factor. And now we have two color swatches to fade in between. The top color swatch will be mapped to our black value, and then the bottom color swatch will be mapped to the white value. So first let's try color picking the blue color that will be mapped to the white value. And yeah, I'll just choose my little eyedropper here and find a nice royal blue. Maybe increase that value just a bit. And actually I have this backwards, so let me copy this blue color swatch by hovering over, hitting Control-C, and then Control-V into color 1. And now for color 2, which is actually plugged into the black value, let's drag that all the way down to black, or at least really close to black. Okay, now let me try adjusting my flags one more time. I want a little bit more black influence over our color. There we go, that'll be good for now. Where I can plug in this output of the mix into the color of our diffuse BSDF, diffuse into the surface output. So here we go, that's the underlying blue paint color. And next let's introduce the glossy component. So Shift A, Shader, Glossy BSDF. And this will be mixed with our diffuse BSDF, so let's also add a shader, mix shader node. And didn't mean to do that. So the glossy BSDF will be plugged into the bottom value. And here we have reflections, but we know we want our reflections to be governed by the Fresnel element, and this will be done in two places. Number one, it will be plugged into our roughness value, and I will choose specific values that I want this color ramp to interpolate in between, the same way I did right here with this color mix node. But this time I will duplicate it, and we don't need color value, so I'll desaturate it entirely. And for our roughness, based on our reference image up here, our reflections are really quite clear. So we want the roughness value to be very small. And if I change the overall roughness to, let's say, 0.01, we can get very, very clear reflections. And also I should mention that these reflections are coming from the environment map that is included with this scene initially. But going back to how the Fresnel needs to affect this glossy, specifically the roughness value, for the surface that faces more directly at the camera, we want a slightly higher roughness value. So remember, this is color slot number 1 that we can reference up here from our previous color mix node. So here in the new color slot 1, let's change the value to be a little bit higher than what I plugged in over here. So let's go to 0.02, or, well, no, I'll actually match that, 0.01. And then for the bottom color swatch, I'm going to make this 0.001. Plug that into the roughness, and then plug our color ramp into the factor. And again, it's very subtle, but hopefully you can tell how the reflections are very, very crisp along the edges of our object, and then the surfaces that are facing more directly are just slightly blurrier. Then on top of this, besides affecting the roughness, we also want to affect how the shader, or how the glossy BSDF, is mixed over top of our diffuse. So let's again duplicate a color mix node, and here I'm going to establish values for the mixing of the glossy over the diffuse. And remember, color slot 1 corresponds to the surface that faces directly at the camera, so we will make that value 0.05. And then color slot 2, we're going to bump up to 0.5. And we can again turn that saturation all the way down. Now plug in our color ramp into the factor and this mix node into the factor of our mix shader node. This produces a much more noticeable result, perhaps too much in fact, where I need to make less contrast between these values. So let's make this upper swatch, let's go to 0.1, and then the lower swatch, let's take that to 0.3. There we go. That's not quite so extreme. Okay, now this is one layer of glossiness, but remember I need two based on our reference right here. So I'm going to duplicate all of our glossy nodes right here, including the mix shader. Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to move that above, and we're going to plug this in after our diffuse BSDF before this first mix shader node. So let me just make a little bit more room for this new glossy component and slide in this duplicated mix shader node after our diffuse. And I'm just going to focus on this new layer of specularity with the diffuse element. So it's a duplicate and the shader looks exactly the same right now, though I need to plug up our color ramp into the factors of each of our color mix nodes up here. And just to clean up some of our connections, let's make sure this is less of a visual mess. And now for this new layer of glossy BSDF, which is under our original glossy layer, the roughness values are going to be higher, allowing for a type of glow underneath our highlights, as we can see in this image. So let's increase these values up top. Number 1, let's change the value to 0.2. And then number 2, let's change it to 0.02. And now we can see how our reflections are blurrier and expand outward. Then let's change the color of our glossy BSDF to match our diffuse down here. So we'll copy that blue and paste it in this color swatch for the glossy. Then perhaps we can tweak the mix factor of this first glossy layer so that we get a little more influence. Let's go to 0.2 up top and then 0.7 down below. There we go. Now what happens when we mix our original glossy component over top of this new one? Now we're starting to get somewhere. If we zoom in on one of our highlights, you can see the bright, very mirror-like reflection of our light source, and we start to get that blue glow around it, similar to our reference up here. But it's not quite perfect. I need to tweak it a little bit more. And first, let's try increasing the roughness value of that first glossy layer so that the reflections blur out and expand a little bit more. So let's change that to 0.3 up top, and then down below, let's increase that to 0.1. There we go. Now we have a broader reflection glow underneath the bright highlights. Let's look elsewhere to see if that holds true. That looks pretty good. Maybe, for one, I don't need any saturation here, but maybe in the top value 0.3 is too much. Let's go back down to 0.2. I want it to be a little bit tighter around the second reflection layer. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And in general, the second reflection layer is a little bit too strong. So let's try dialing back the values of our factor for the mix shader, which is done right here in this color mix node. Let's see, let's go from a value of 0.1 up top to 0.05. Let's just cut both values in half. And then 0.3, let's go to 0.2 instead. And yeah, that's looking a lot better. Let's try doing a render now. And if we compare it to our reference, we're actually getting pretty close. Notice how the underlying blue color fades from a bright, vibrant blue to a darker value, just like it does here, with the reflections also increasing in intensity as we approach the outer edges, just like they do here at the wheel well. The only thing that we're really missing is the flaky quality, the speckliness of that first glossy layer. So let's go ahead and add that. I'll switch to slot number 7, the next slot, so I can compare before and after. And then switch this back to the node editor. And I'm simply going to slide in a very small Musgrave texture to be added to the factor of our first glossy BSDF over the diffuse. So let's add that texture, Musgrave, and we will plug this into our emission node just to see the black and white values in their raw form before we plug them into the influence of the factor. And Blender just crashed. Awesome. Okay, let's try and salvage this. Okay, luckily I was able to salvage a recovered file by going to File, Recover Autosave, and opening this guy right here, which is lucky. It's definitely not ideal, so I'm going to be sure to save this file right now. And where were we? Back to the flakes, the speckliness of that first glossy layer. So I need to add a texture, Musgrave texture. And then we'll plug this into the emission node. Musgrave into that emission and Shift-Z to enable viewport rendering. And this is the default result of our Musgrave, and I'll leave everything default except for the scale. I'm going to increase that to, let's try 200 first, and now if we zoom in we can see that that's getting very finely detailed, but not quite enough. How about 500? Yeah, I think that should be good. And now I just need to add this over top of this color mix node that we've plugged into the mix shader, and specifically the factor slot that is governing this first layer of glossiness over the diffuse. So Shift A, or instead of adding a new one, let's just duplicate this mix node, change the operation to add, and then plug in our Musgrave texture into the second color slot. And now plug in our original shader output into the surface. And if we zoom in here on that first layer of glossiness, we start to see it speckling. Then we can dial in maybe the size. Let's try 400 to make the flakes a little bit bigger. There we go. Now let's do another render to compare it with the first one. All right, let's maximize this view to compare it with the first render. You can see those sparkles showing up pretty good. Let's hit Alt-J. And it's definitely subtle, but we can see the change. Let me zoom in to make sure you can see it, especially down here, Alt-J. This is without the specks. Here it is with the specks. And that's just a nice finishing touch. That's, again, a very prominent characteristic in this type of car paint. And that's going to be all for this particular shader. All that's left now is to apply this to an actual car model to see how it looks in the proper context. Here it is, applied to Mike Pan's BMW scene. Thanks so much for watching. We will do another material soon.